Mark 9:14-29. Help my unbelief. After the transfiguration, it must have been strange to come down the mountain and see a crowd and the scribes and disciples arguing about something. Hadn't they seen the brilliance of Jesus' glory? Hadn't they seen Moses and Elijah? Hadn't they heard the voice of God the Father telling them to listen to his Son? The answer to all of those questions is no. These people had not been part of that incredible event. Instead, the crowd was watching a dispute between the scribes and disciples, which was going nowhere. Let's read from Mark chapter 9. And when he came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them, and scribes disputing with them. Immediately when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed, and running to him greeted him. And he asked the scribes, "What are you discussing with them?" Then one of the crowd answered and said, "Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit, and wherever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not." Our first point today is Jesus was told about the problem, and that covers Mark 9:14-18. What does it say? When Jesus came back to the rest of his disciples, he saw an immense crowd around them. He also saw that some religious scribes were arguing with his disciples. As soon as Jesus arrived, the crowd ran to him and greeted him. Jesus then asked the scribes what they were talking about with his disciples. But before they could answer, someone in the crowd told him the situation. The man had a son who was possessed by a mute spirit. He had brought him to Jesus. The demon would seize him, throw him down, cause him to foam at the mouth, to gnash his teeth, and to become completely rigid. The man had asked Jesus' disciples to cast out the demon, but they could not. So what does it mean? First, the religious leaders were still a problem. You see that in verse 14, how they were arguing with the disciples. When Jesus and the 3 disciples arrived, some scribes were arguing with the remaining 9 disciples. The word for argue carries combative connotations and is often used by Mark for altercations with religious authorities. We're not told what the issue was, but the dispute was happening nonetheless. Lenski suggests that the scribes were delighted by the failure of the disciples and taunted them and shamed them before the crowd. If I were to guess the reason for the dispute, it was probably an argument on how to handle the demon-possessed child. But the religious leaders were still a problem. Secondly, the demons were still actively harming people. We see that in verses 17-18. As in other cases, a demon was causing harm to a person. Remember the demoniac of Gadara? The demons possessing him caused him to cut himself and caused him to yell out in pain. In this case, the child seemed to be completely miserable. It seized him, threw him down, made him foam at the mouth, gnash his teeth, and become rigid. One person has said the demon's attempts to destroy the lad show again the purpose of demon possession. And if you think about it, has there ever been a demon possession where it went well for that person? I am unaware of that ever happening. It seems that demons are always trying to destroy someone's life and to make their friends and family miserable in the process. But that should come as no surprise, as Satan was a murderer from the beginning and is the father of lies. The third thing we see here is the disciples had failed. We see that in verse 18. The troubled father had probably heard about Jesus and the disciples having success in casting out demons before, but when he asked the disciples to help him, they were unable. The father's appeal to the disciples to cast out the demon was legitimate, because Jesus had given them authority over evil spirits. Remember when they were sent out to preach and help people? They came back excited that they had been able to cast out demons, but in this situation, they had been powerless to help. Now, how does this apply? Well, everything was going wrong here. The scribes were arguing with the disciples. A demon was harming a child. A father was looking for help, but the disciples couldn't help him. It's a vivid picture of a time where everything was wrong and there was no hope that things would turn out for the good. But did you notice what happened in Mark 9:15? Jesus arrived and the crowd ran to him. And that is what made the difference in this situation. No matter how bad your day becomes, no matter how many people are against you, and no matter how many times you fail yourself, Jesus can make everything right. When you face those difficulties, be sure to run to Jesus for help. But how can you do this since Jesus is not physically here to talk to? You can turn to the Lord in any situation by prayer and Bible reading. When you read the Bible, for instance, God has a way of speaking to you through its words because it's inspired by Him. When you pray, you're talking to God and allowing Him to give you the peace and provide the solution that you need. So look to the Lord for the hope and help you need every day. The second section is Jesus saw the need for faith. And here I'll read verses 19 to 24. He answered him and said, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me. Then they brought him to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. So he asked his father, How long has this been happening to him? And he said, From childhood. And often he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Jesus said to him, If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. So what does it say? Jesus had responded to the man's explanation by expressing first his frustration with the current faithless generation. He wondered out loud how long he would be with them or bear with them. He then told the man to bring the boy to him. And when he had been brought to Jesus, the Spirit caused the boy to go into convulsions, to fall on the ground, and to foam at the mouth. What a terrible sight that must have been. Jesus asked the father how long this had been happening. The man told Jesus that it had been happening since he was a child. The demon would cause him to be thrown into the fire or water to destroy him. But the man wasn't interested in talking anymore. He pled with Jesus to have compassion on them and to help if he was able. Jesus told the man that if he could believe, all things were possible. The man burst into tears and told Jesus that he believed but needed help with his unbelief. What a story. Now, what does it mean? First, Jesus was frustrated with their lack of faith. We see that in verse 19. To whom was Jesus speaking these words of frustration? Mark says that he answered the man, but then he addressed the generation. He could have been speaking to the man himself, who was one more example of unbelieving people during that generation. Or he could have been speaking to the whole group of people who were known for their lack of faith. Perhaps you remember how Jesus was unable to do many miracles because of the lack of faith in one area. That was in Mark chapter 6. He could also have been speaking to the disciples who had not been able to cast out the demon. We may never know conclusively, but Jesus was very frustrated with the lack of faith he witnessed at that time. A second thought. Jesus wanted to know the details about the child's problem. We find that in verse 21. I find it interesting here that Jesus stopped to ask the man how long this had been happening to his son. It almost comes off as Jesus being calloused to the problem that was happening at that exact moment. But we should not look at it that way. We should instead see in Jesus' question his concern for the man and his son. He asked about the situation because he wanted to hear from the man. He also wanted to show the man what a serious request he was asking of him. He probably also asked so that the disciples and any other people in the crowd would know how bad things had been. But the most important thing to see here is that Jesus cared about the man and his son enough to ask that question. Now, there are some who regard this child's problems as just normal epilepsy. they do this because some of the symptoms match what happened during an epileptic seizure. They also do this because they don't believe that the Bible is true and that Jesus is the Son of God. So there's a big problem. But there is good reason to believe otherwise. First, Mark says that the demon caused the boy to convulse. The demon did it. Second, Jesus addressed the demon as the cause of the problem. And third, after casting out the demon, the symptoms were gone. To claim that demon possession was not involved would be to call Jesus a liar. Not a good idea. Now a question. Should we look at all epileptic seizures as the result of demon possession? Well, that was the problem in this situation. It wasn't always. A survey of the people healed by Jesus will show that sometimes they were simply suffering from a normal physical ailment. Peter's mother-in-law was healed of a fever. The paralyzed man lowered through a hole in the roof was healed with no mention of a demon. The deaf man with a speech impediment and the blind man were both healed of physical problems with no mention of demon possession. Because of this, we need to be careful about attributing every ailment to the work of Satan or one of his demons. The second thought, Jesus wanted the man to believe. We see that in verse 23. If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. Besides his desire to help the child, Jesus wanted the man to have faith in him. He wanted the man to believe that he was able to do what was needed. This is why God often allows us to go through difficult situations, because they point us to our need of him. Sadly, the words, "if you can do anything," indicate that the fact that the disciples hadn't been able to cast out the demon was now making the Father think that maybe Jesus couldn't do it. But he needed to believe. He needed to believe, but he was having difficulty in seeing a positive conclusion to his son's problem. Nobody had been able to help for a long time. When Jesus told the man that all things were possible to those who believe, the man was triggered. He immediately responded to Jesus with words he had until that moment been holding back. His statement came straight from his heart. "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." He had a small amount of faith, but he was beginning to wonder if Jesus would ever do anything for his son. With everything now out in the open, Jesus performed this miracle and gave good reason for this man to believe him in the future. Now, how does it apply? Some believe that faith is necessary for all miracles, and if you don't have faith, then Jesus can't do anything. Wait a minute. Do you really believe that? Is Jesus unable to heal a blind man, cast out a demon, or restore someone's hearing only if they believe him? Well, there was a time when Jesus did only a few miracles because of the unbelief of the people. This was probably done, as one man says, for the simple reason that miracles would be wasted on such people. But I'm not convinced that Jesus' power is limited by the lack of faith of the person needing to be healed. Remember, Jesus is God. He can do anything. However, we do know that without faith it is impossible to please him. Hebrews 11:6. Those who believe in the God of the impossible often see him do what might not have been accomplished otherwise. Read through Hebrews chapter 11, and you will see many times that God rewarded the faith of those who put their trust in him. And by the way, if you're not familiar with some of the names in Hebrews 11, go back into the book of Genesis and the following books and look up the names of those people and see the many times that they trusted the Lord and what he did. And I think this is the goal of the Lord in every situation. He wants us to trust in his ability to do whatever is needed. And sometimes he does it despite our lack of faith. But he still wants us to come to the place where our confidence is in him alone. Our third point, Jesus casts out the demon. I'll read verses 25 through 29. When Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "Deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more." Then the spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him. And he became as one dead, so that many said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" So he said to them, "This kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting." So what does it say? When Jesus noticed that a crowd was forming, he rebuked the demon. He addressed it as a deaf and mute spirit and told it to come out of the boy and never come back. The demon cried out, caused him to go into convulsions, and then came out of the boy. The boy lay on the ground like a dead person and had people believing that he actually had died. But Jesus took him by the hand and helped him to get up. Later, when he and the disciples were in the house, they asked Jesus why they could not cast out the demon. Jesus told them that this type of demon would only come out after prayer and fasting. Now, what does it mean? First of all, Jesus was able to cast out the demon. We see that in verses 25 through 27. It should come as no surprise that Jesus was able to do this. In our study so far of the Gospel of Mark, we have seen Jesus cast out a demon several times. For instance, he cast out demons in a synagogue in chapter 1, at night in chapter 1, by the sea, chapter 3, in the country of the Gadarenes, chapter 5, and remotely just by saying the word for the Syrophoenician woman's daughter, chapter 7. If that were not enough, Jesus also gave his disciples the ability to heal and cast out demons, chapter 6. So Jesus was able to do this because, why? Because he is God, and God can do anything. A second thought. The demon was not happy to comply. We see that in verse 26. It's interesting that the demon inside this boy was none too happy to be sent out. With cruelty in mind, the demon tormented the child a little more before obeying Jesus' command. It cried out, although it was a mute spirit, caused him to go into severe convulsions, and left him lying on the ground as if dead. Demons are never happy to do God's bidding and will often do as much evil as they can get away with before obeying. Thankfully, Jesus was able to remove the demon and raise the child back to health despite the best efforts of the demon. A third thought. Some situations require more than expected. We find that in verses 28 and 29. You can imagine the chagrin of the disciples as they were publicly humiliated in front of the religious scribes and the large crowd of people. They had previously been given the ability to heal people and to cast out demons, but in this situation they had failed. What had happened? Jesus told them that this kind of demon would not come out unless they prayed and fasted. It may be, as one commentator said, that the disciples had failed because they had not prayerfully depended on God's power. But, whatever the case, Jesus instructed them that there would be times when they would need to spend much time in prayer and even set aside food for a time to plead with God for help. Now, how does it apply? There are times when you may feel very confident. The disciples had been very confident in their own abilities after seeing such success on their preaching and healing journeys. But this time they were confronted with something they could not handle. This demon was more than they could handle, but the Lord was able to handle the situation. The spirit who had been too strong for the disciples, Jesus was able to cast out. He spoke with authority, and Satan was obliged to do what he said. What do we learn here? We learn that the ultimate answer to all of our difficulties is found in Jesus. While there may be some things that God gives us the strength to handle, we must remember that it is He who enabled us to do those things. There will also be things that we are unable to handle in our own strength. And as J.C. Ryle says, let us learn a lesson of humility from the failure of the disciples. Let us strive to realize every day our need of grace and the presence of Christ. With Him we may do all things. Without Him we can do nothing at all. As you go about your business this week, will you set aside your own self-confidence and begin to rely on the Lord for every need that you have? This is where you will find the strength, ability, and peace that you need. It is all found in Jesus. Will you trust Him? Our conclusion. Did you notice what is missing from the story? At the end of the miracle, Jesus lifts the boy by the hand and he gets up. But that is the last we hear about the boy or his father. We might say the same thing about many of the people whom Jesus healed. I wonder what happened to them after he left. There is no doubt that they never forgot what Jesus did for them and that they were thankful. But in my mind, I wonder, did they come back and listen to Jesus' teaching? Did they become his disciples at a later time? Did they spread the news about what he had done for them? We may never know.